I wish I could remember what happened. I'm just so sorry. I'm heartbroken. I love Dom and Davion. We were all friends, and Dom was my soulmate. I wish I could take all your pain away, and I'm so sorry.
Now you can see that Mee broke down right as that verdict was read. She was obviously hoping that the jury would convict her on a lesser charge, perhaps accessory to murder or manslaughter. Now, though, she'll spend the rest of her life behind bars for the murder of Shannon Griffin.
This case is the single most cold, calculated, premeditated case of murder that I have ever seen.
When it comes to killer teens, more often than not, it is teenage boys who we see on the news facing justice for murder. But that doesn't mean that teenage girls aren't also capable of evil acts that are so horrific they will shock you to your core. The following stories tell the tale of killer teen girls who were sentenced to life behind bars for their murders.
There's only one person who's responsible for the pain of everyone in this room, and that person is you, McKenzie. Nobody else is responsible. This isn't the fault of Dominic's family, or Davion's family, or your family.
McKenzie Shilla murdered my son, Dominic, as well as Davion.
I'm so deeply sorry. I hope one day you can see I would never let this happen or do it on purpose.
She decides she is going to end everyone's life. Let's watch.
Hell on wheels. That's how a judge would refer to 19-year-old McKenzie Shilla in court as she prepared to sentence her for the 2022 murder of her boyfriend, 20-year-old Dominic Russo, and his 19-year-old friend, Davion Flanagan. This is a truly heartbreaking and tragic case that destroyed the lives of different families. It all happened on one tragic night in Strongsville, Ohio, when the 17-year-old McKenzie made up a series of decisions that she could never take back. These were decisions that ended up ruining her life and cutting Dominic and Davion's lives short for no reason. But who exactly is McKenzie Shilla, and how did she ever get to the point where she thought that this was the right thing to do? Let's take a step back and break down this case. McKenzie and Dominic began dating in 2021 when they were both still in high school. Like a lot of high school relationships, things between these two always seemed to involve some sort of drama. They would break up, then get back together, and then do it all over again. While most would agree that a relationship like this sounds pretty toxic, nobody could have guessed, just by this couple's tumultuous relationship, that things would ever end up the way that they did in July of 2022. Dominic and Davion were both smart and talented young men with bright futures ahead of them and big plans for what they wanted to do with their lives. Dominic had his own business that he had just gotten started, but it was already doing well. Davion was a skilled football player who had dreamed of opening up his own barbershop one day. But neither of these young men would ever get the chance to finish the exciting things they had started. On the night that it all happened, McKenzie, Dominic, and Davion were all at a party together. They were smoking and all hanging out. While we may never know exactly what they talked about or what they were fighting about, we know that McKenzie and Dominic had been arguing that night. When it came time to leave, the couple agreed to give Davion a ride home, and then they all got into McKenzie's Toyota Camry. Davion and Dominic had trusted McKenzie to get them home safely, but they had no idea what was in store for them just a short time later. While McKenzie sped down the nearly empty streets of Strongsville in the early morning hours of July 31st, 2022, she was angry, emotional, and determined to do something horrible. She had already made up her mind that on that night, everyone in the car was going to die. It's hard to imagine what Dominic and Davion could have been thinking as they watched McKenzie push her car to go faster and faster, putting them and everyone else on the road in harm's way. As the vehicle got closer and closer to a large brick building in the center of an intersection, McKenzie made no attempt to try to avoid it. She just sped up even more, slammed her car into a brick wall at 100 miles per hour without making any attempt to stop. McKenzie's plan had failed. She had wanted to take her own life and the lives of both Dominic and Davion that night. But ultimately, she was the only one who survived the crash. Because it was the middle of the night, it was 45 minutes before anyone noticed the crash and tried to help pull the three teens from the rubble. McKenzie was rushed to the hospital where she received treatment for her injuries, but both Dominic and Davion were pronounced dead at the scene. By the time the community was waking up the next morning, news of the tragedy had already begun to spread.
Strongsville police say a passerby noticed a smashed-up car. up against a building in the Progress Drive Business Park around 6:15 Sunday morning. Investigators say it appears the car failed to stop at the end of Progress Drive, traveled across the lawn of the business, hit a sign, and then crashed into the building.
Law enforcement knew early on that McKenzie had been the one behind the wheel, but they did not know what happened or what had caused the crash.
Police say it appears McKenzie Shilla was driving, and speed was one of the factors.
I think it played a role, but it's still difficult to say how fast the car was going. But with the kind of damage that was there, the way the vehicle struck the sign and then the building, all plays a role in it.
Two well-known and well-loved young members of the community were dead, and the whole city felt devastated from the loss.
Hearts grieve right now for the families. I think anybody that has children can really commiserate with this loss. Our heart breaks for them.
Was this all just a horrible accident? Had McKenzie taken something that caused her to lose control of the vehicle? Those were the questions that everyone was wondering. But it wasn't until detectives played back the security footage from the moments leading up to the crash that they realized this was no mistake. It was intentional.
As you review that exhibit, you know that you are watching the oncoming deaths of two people, and there is nothing that will stop it. The video clearly shows the purpose and intent of the defendant. She chose a course of death and destruction that day. Exhibit 802 crystallizes the deadly decision-making of the defendant. She morphs from a responsible driver to literal hell on wheels as she makes her way down the street.
What caused McKenzie to snap and do something like this? She knew that she was likely going to die if she followed through with the plan. If anything, it had been nothing more than an unexpected twist of fate that she survived, while Dominic and Davian died. Well, as it turns out, McKenzie had made threats to Dominic in the past. Once, a friend of Dominic's was on the phone with him while he had been in the car with McKenzie. The friend heard McKenzie threaten Dominic by saying, "I will crash this car right now." But that's not all. In the months leading up to the murders of these two men, McKenzie's behavior toward Dominic had been nothing short of evil. The proof of this could all be discovered on Dominic's phone. There were videos, text messages, and much more evidence that showed that McKenzie would often threaten his life in different ways, and would also threaten to destroy his property. This was clearly someone who was totally unhinged and had no business being behind the wheel of any car or being responsible for anyone's lives. Eventually, McKenzie was released from the hospital and appeared to be ready to move on with her life after this tragedy. But law enforcement were not going to let this happen. Armed with loads of evidence against her, they arrested McKenzie and charged her with 2 counts of murder. Finally, McKenzie, the person who many people referred to as spoiled and entitled, would find out that not even she could get away without facing the consequences at the time.
This trial is a culmination of decisions made by one person, the defendant. Those decisions have forever altered the futures of 3 families, and of you also, McKenzie. And your decisions forever robbed Dominic and Davian of the futures that they had before them.
McKenzie, who claimed she could remember nothing from the crash, was tried as an adult in this case. Throughout the very dramatic trial, those in the courtroom would have to watch the surveillance footage that showed McKenzie's car slamming into that brick wall with Dominic and Davian inside. They would hear that unforgettable sound of crushing metal as the Toyota was smashed into bits, and imagine what happened to the bodies of Dominic and Davian the second that the car hit the brick wall. They would hear about how McKenzie had been doing that night and that she was likely high at the time of the crash. They would also hear about how when McKenzie found out she was arrested in connection to Davian and Dominic's murders, her biggest concern was the fact that she would be losing her driver's license. But at the end of the day, it was the judge presiding over the case, Nancy Margaret Russo, who would be the one who decided the verdict, as well as McKenzie's fate. While preparing to read her verdict, Judge Russo recapped the case and gave chilling comments that showed how much this horrific case had affected her personally.
In criminal cases, the state carries the greatest burden under our law, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. As I previously stated, I considered all the evidence presented, and at this point I would like to comment specifically on Exhibit 802, the crash video. This is the type of evidence you can never unsee. You can never forget the visual or audio of this exhibit. It is chilling and tragic.
McKenzie sat in the courtroom with her hands clasped nervously as she waited for the judge to announce her verdict. She looked a lot different on this judgment day than she looked in past photos from before murders. Gone were the fake eyelashes, the fancy dresses, and all the makeup. The 19-year-old's face was bare, and her expression was terrified as she prepared for what she probably already knew was coming. Judge Russo took her time as she went over the case, making sure to point out each choice that McKenzie made along the way that led up to the end of Dominic and Davian's lives.
McKenzie alone made the decision to drive the car, to drive an obscure route, a route she visited a few days before, and a route not routinely taken by her. McKenzie alone chose the time to make the drive, early in the morning, when any reasonable person would expect that few people would be nearby to witness it or offer life-saving assistance. She made these decisions despite knowing, as any reasonable person would, that her mission of death could have involved others, not even in the car with her. Other people, other cars, pedestrians.
She made it clear that there was only one person to blame for this tragedy, and that person was McKenzie.
She had a mission, and she executed it with precision. The mission was death. McKenzie alone decided to push the pedal to the floor and demand the ultimate speed of that vehicle to 90 to 100 miles per hour. She alone decided what was to be. McKenzie decided death was the ultimate goal that day, and she alone made that decision for Dominic and Davian, and she continuously acted in a manner to achieve the purpose. Whether or not she intended to also kill herself is a matter of speculation.
Judge Russo had already made how she felt about this defendant and this case clear, and all that was left to do was officially convict McKenzie.
This was not reckless driving. This was murder. Court renders the following verdicts. Count 1. The court, having had count 1 tried to it pursuant to waiver, finds the defendant, McKenzie Shilla, guilty of murder, to wit Dominic Russo, in violation of Ohio Revised Code Section 2903.02a, is charged in count 1.
McKenzie was convicted on every count. There were 12 counts in total, and they included murder, felonious assault, and aggravated vehicular homicide. Prior to her sentencing in August of 2023, McKenzie was given the chance to make a statement in court. This was probably the last chance that she would ever get to speak publicly and try to explain herself. She chose to stick with the same story she always told.
I wish I could remember what happened. I'm just so sorry. I'm heartbroken. I love Dom and Davian. We were all friends, and Dom was my soulmate. I wish I could take all your pain away, and I'm so sorry.
Finally, it was time for McKenzie to learn her fate. Was the judge going to go with the harshest possible sentence, or have mercy on her?
She sentenced on count 1, the murder of Dominic Russo, 15 years to life.
McKenzie received 2 concurrent 15 years to life sentences. This means that it is possible that in 15 years she could be out of prison, but the judge noted that she considers this very unlikely. Judge Russo said that a powerful lesson can be learned from this case, and hopefully it is one that will impact many different people.
If there is one thing that can be taken away from this case, as painful as it is this. Every decision we make is important. Every action we make is important. Regardless of whether the decision is a good one or a bad one, or the actions are good or not, the result is the same. The consequences ripple through time and affect many more people than one might think at the time of the decision.
This case is pretty unique. That's because the killer in this story was already famous before the crime actually took place, and what she was famous for had nothing to do with murder. In fact, she was famous for probably one of the weirdest things that anybody could get famous for, an incredibly long case of hiccups. In 2007, Jennifer Mee was 15 years old and she got a case of the hiccups. Pretty normal, right? This is something that most of us experience from time to time. But the difference with Jennifer's case of the hiccups is that day after day passed and still these hiccups would not go away. This actually became pretty uncomfortable. and kind of a serious problem for Jennifer because they got in the way of her daily life. She couldn't go to school, play sports, or basically do any of her old hobbies that she enjoyed. But there was one plus side to this bizarre health condition that Jennifer was experiencing. It was that for a little while, it made her pretty famous. She earned the nickname Hiccup Girl, and Jennifer went on news programs like NBC's Today Show and made an appearance on a medical show where a group of doctors discussed her condition and what could have caused it.
4 weeks ago tomorrow.
And the sound is the least of it.
I get really bad chest pain, abdominal pains, throat pains, back pains. It's unbelievable.
People were pretty much mystified by Jennifer's case, and she got a lot of attention from it, which, just like a lot of 15-year-old girls would, Jennifer started to enjoy. But you can probably guess what happened next. Eventually, Jennifer's hiccups went away, and when that happened, it wasn't very long until Jennifer's fame ended up going away too. Now she went from being the girl on TV with a mysterious health condition to just being a normal teenager again. Jennifer missed the fame, and so she started to think about what she could do to get that fame back. She could have channeled this desire for fame into a lot of positive things. Maybe she could have worked on developing a skill, doing something good for the community, or helping someone in need. But she didn't do that. Instead, she came up with a very dark and disturbing plan that would end up completely ruining her life and bringing another innocent person's life to an abrupt end. In 2010, Jennifer met this guy online named Lamont Newton, and together they began to scheme about the different ways that they could make a quick buck without getting caught. They decided to plan a robbery that would begin with Jennifer enticing and luring the victim and end with Lamont taking the guy's money. It didn't take long for them to find their first victim, a 22-year-old man named Shannon Griffin. Jennifer started chatting with Shannon online, and they arranged to meet up. She promised him she would give him some weed. Shannon, who was also attracted to Jennifer, agreed pretty willingly and didn't suspect a thing. Jennifer lured Shannon to a vacant home where Lamont and another friend were waiting to rob him, and it took a very extreme turn. Instead of just a robbery, one thing led to another, and Jennifer's friends ended up firing at Shannon 4 times and killing him. After stealing the $50 that their victim had been carrying on him, everyone fled the scene. Jennifer and the 2 accomplices were found and arrested just a short time after the murder, and each of them admitted to what they had done. They were all 3 charged in connection to the murder. It didn't matter that Jennifer wasn't the one that ultimately pulled the trigger. It also didn't matter that, as she later claimed, she didn't plan for Shannon to die and had no idea that her friends were going to end up taking his life. The only thing that mattered to law enforcement was that a man was dead, and she had played a role in the reason why. Jennifer's trial was filled with twists and turns. Part of her defense was that she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but ultimately, the judge had declared her mentally stable enough to stand trial, so this didn't help her out very much. Her only hope was that jurors would believe that because she wasn't the one that fired the weapon at Shannon, that she was not guilty of his murder. At the end of the day, all the victim's family wanted was justice for Shannon, but they knew that no matter what the jury decided, it wasn't going to reunite them with their lost loved one.
Prosecutors told jurors today that even though Mee did not pull that trigger 3 years ago, she ultimately orchestrated Griffin's death and lured him to that robbery gone wrong. Tonight, I did speak with Griffin's mother, and she said that no matter what this verdict was going to be tonight, it will never bring back her son.
Finally, on the day that it was announced that the jury had reached their verdict, everyone gathered at the courthouse, and tension in the air was incredibly thick. There was no telling which way things were going to go. Jennifer's mother seemed especially nervous as she prepared to learn her daughter's fate.
In just the past half hour, we've seen a flurry of activity right here outside the courthouse as family members from both sides in this case stormed out, emotions running very high, a lot of tears being shed, but the most visibly shaken was Mee's mother. She was not able to make it back into the courtroom for the verdict. When she finally got there and walked in, all that she could see was that her daughter was crying hysterically.
Watch Jennifer's fate as the jury's decision is read out loud.
The jury finds as follows: the defendant in this case, the defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree as charged. So say we all.
Ultimately, the disappointment and despair on Jennifer's face was evident. All hope of her somehow getting out of all of this was lost. She knew what that verdict meant. There was no chance she was ever getting out of jail.
Now you can see that Mee broke down right as that verdict was read. She was obviously hoping that the jury would convict her on a lesser charge, perhaps accessory to murder or manslaughter. Now, though, she'll spend the rest of her life behind bars for the murder of Shannon Griffin.
It was decided that Jennifer be sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Some people found this sentence to be a little harsh considering the circumstances, while others felt like Jennifer got what she deserved. After all, because of her actions, Shannon no longer got to have a life, so why should she be able to enjoy hers? Shannon's loved ones made it clear that they wanted the focus to be on him and not Jennifer and her co-defendants' horrific, evil actions.
We've always wanted it to be about the victim, who is Shannon Griffin, and it's not about it's just, just too much right now, because we are still grieving, and we just wanted it to be about him.
After finding out that her daughter would be spending the rest of her life in prison, Jennifer's mother appeared devastated. She had to have help walking as she made her way out of the courtroom, her daughter's fate now sealed. Jennifer attempted to get a new trial to see if she could do things differently and somehow get at least a chance at parole, but this was denied. Instead, it was decided that her sentence should stand. So for now, Jennifer remains locked up at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Marion County, Florida. This is the largest women's prison in the United States, and unless something changes, this will be Jennifer's home for the rest of her life. Years after her sentencing, after she had time to reflect on everything that happened, Jennifer did an interview where she talked about the role she played in Shannon's murder. She is still sticking by the same claim she always has, which is that she never knew that Shannon was going to be killed, and she would have never participated in all of this if she had. She also admitted to experimenting with illegal substances when she was young, and she believes that this played a role in the bad decisions she made. But these decisions she's referring to are the ones that led to a man's death and her spending the rest of her life locked up.
Got cased up with the wrong crowd of people, really. Unfortunately, when I started experimenting with drugs, I just felt like I was invincible to everything.
She retold the story of what happened on that tragic night, explaining that as soon as she heard that firearm going off for the first time, she fled the scene.
I walked off, I was to the corner, I heard the first gunshot. After the first gunshot, I ran.
You are listening to me describing to detectives the shooting death of 22-year-old Shannon Griffin last October. Gasping through tears, she admits meeting Griffin online and luring him to a vacant home with promises of marijuana, but there was no marijuana.
It's hard to imagine what it would be like to wake up every single day in a prison cell and know that this is the exact same life you will have forever. But Jennifer says that not every day is full of despair. Sometimes she is able to accept what has happened and that this is now her fate for the rest of her life.
It's like, this is a nightmare. You know what I mean? And then there's other days where it's just like, it is what it is.
But that doesn't mean that there aren't still plenty of questions that keep her up at night wondering what if? What if she had never agreed to lure Shannon out of that house? What if she had never met Lamont in the first place? Would she still have her freedom?
I still truly don't know and understand what took place for them to do what they did.
Do you think that life in prison without a chance for parole is fair for what Jennifer did? Let us know what you think in the comments.
A pair of siblings who killed a 15-year-old learned their fate.
A judge sentenced 17-year-old Kyle Hooper and his sister Amber Wright to life in prison. The two were found guilty of beating, shooting, and burning the body of 15-year-old Seth Jackson. Wright and Hooper were part of a plot to kill Jackson in Marion County last year.
This is the story of the murder of Seth Jackson, a boy who never got to make it to his 16th birthday after falling into a bad crowd of people who would eventually cost him his life. When Seth was 15, he began dating a young girl named Amber Wright. While the two of them were only together for a short time, he really cared about her. Unfortunately, the moment that this young man met Amber was when all of his problems would begin. Amber was not a good girlfriend. She was manipulative and, as Seth would eventually find out, a cheater. After Seth and Amber had gone through a very dramatic and very messy breakup, it was revealed to Seth that while he and Amber had been together, she had been seeing another guy on the side. This guy's name was Michael Bargo, and he was 18 years old. Amber had lied to Michael and told him that she had suffered abuse at the hands of Seth, which was not in the least bit true. But because Michael believed this, he was eager to get revenge on Seth and planned to do so with violence. Amber knew what Michael was planning to do and did nothing to stop it. Instead, she helped him. The two of them also enlisted Amber's brother, Kyle Hooper, and two other friends, Justin Soto and Charlie Eli, to help them with their sadistic, evil plan they were concocting. The teens lured Seth to Charlie's house, where they ambushed him and brutally attacked him. When he realized what was happening, Seth fought as hard as he could for his life, but he was no match for these monsters who were intent on taking his life.
After being beaten and shot several times, Seth still managed to run outside, where Kyle again made a choice to continue with the plan and bring Seth back inside, knowing he would not live.
Ultimately, after being horribly injured, Seth was dragged back inside the house, thrown into a bathroom, and beaten even more until he passed away. The teens then tried to dispose of the evidence of what they had done by wrapping his body in a sleeping bag and throwing it in a fire pit. It was Kyle ultimately who could not handle the guilt of the depraved things he had just been a part of. He ended up breaking down and telling his mom everything. Not long after, he and everyone else who had been involved in Seth's murder were arrested and charged.
Well, just 30 minutes ago, the judge sentenced 16-year-old Amber Wright to life in prison. She chose not to speak on her own behalf, refused to look at pictures of Seth Jackson that were put on the screen. In the same courtroom hours earlier, her brother, Kyle Hooper, got the same sentence.
Even though Amber decided not to speak in court, her brother did take his opportunity to show remorse.
Kyle Hooper himself took the stand. He was soft-spoken, apologized.
I know it may not help or bring him back in any way, but I am sorry.
Amber and Kyle were both given life with no chance of parole, while Michael Bargo was sentenced to death for his part in the murder. The judge got right to the point when describing how atrocious and downright evil this case was.
This case is the single most cold, calculated, premeditated case of murder that I have ever seen.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.